Back here, back here. You gotta see that.
Who shot him?
I don't know. I don't know.
But the true horror of this story didn't begin in a courtroom, and it didn't even begin with the gunshot that shattered a quiet Monday morning. The true horror began in the fractured mind of a man who looked at his friends and saw monsters. A man who looked at human faces and saw shapeshifters, and who walked into a backyard shed in Las Cruces, New Mexico, to execute a father of two because a voice in his head told him it was necessary. But the most chilling aspect of this case isn't the killer, Izzy, Renea, or even the gruesome nature of the execution-style murder of Steven Sanchez Jr. It is the eyes through which we see this tragedy unfold. The primary witness, the person who walked into that blood-soaked shed and stood inches away from an armed and delusional murderer, was a woman in the final stages of pregnancy. She was a woman carrying life, forced to stare directly into the eyes of death, unprotected and vulnerable in the dead of night, realizing that the man standing before her had completely detached from reality. This is the story of the Princess Jean Drive murder, a case where paranoia met opportunity, and where a celebration of life turned into a frantic fight for survival. The timeline of a tragedy often distorts the perception of those involved, stretching seconds into hours and compressing hours into fleeting moments of panic. But for the pregnant woman living at the home on the 1900 block of Princess Jean Drive, time seemed to stop entirely at 3 a.m. on Monday, April 29, 2024. The silence of the desert night in Las Cruces, New Mexico, is heavy and absolute, usually offering a respite from the scorching heat of the day, but on this specific morning, the silence was a veil hiding a gruesome reality. The woman, whose name has been protected to shield her and her unborn child from the trauma of public scrutiny, was awake when the rest of the world was sleeping, a common occurrence for expectant mothers nearing their due date. But tonight her wakefulness was driven by a sudden, piercing noise that shattered the tranquility of the suburb. She had been inside the main house, perhaps resting her hand on her stomach, feeling the movements of the life inside her, when the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed from the backyard, a sound so distinct and violent that it instantly triggered a primal, biological alarm system within her. Despite the physical burden of her pregnancy, despite the swelling in her feet and the exhaustion that comes with carrying a child, she did not cower or hide. Instead, she moved toward the danger, drawn by a terrifying intuition that something had gone wrong in the shed where the men had gathered only minutes before. As she crossed the threshold of the back door and stepped onto the cool grass of the yard, the darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, transforming the familiar sanctuary of her family's home into a landscape of dread. The shed, a simple structure usually reserved for storage or quiet conversations away from the main house, stood ominously silent in the corner of the yard, its door slightly ajar and spilling a sliver of artificial light onto the lawn. Every step she took was a battle between the maternal instinct to flee and protect her unborn child and the desperate need to know the fate of her friends, specifically Steven Sanchez Jr., a man who had just celebrated his 34th birthday hours prior. When she finally reached the structure and pushed the door open, the smell would have hit her first, the metallic, copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the dust and oil of the shed, a sensory assault that no human being is ever prepared for, let alone a woman in her condition. Inside, the scene was a tableau of senseless violence. Steven Sanchez Jr. lay on the floor, his life extinguished in an instant by a gunshot wound to the head, his body motionless in a way that signals the immediate and permanent departure of the soul. But he was not alone in that cramped space. Standing over him, gun still in hand, was Izzy Renea, a figure who looked less like a man and more like a specter of chaos. The psychological weight of this confrontation cannot be overstated, as we must consider the sheer vulnerability of the witness in this precise moment. She stood there, physically limited by her pregnancy, unable to run fast, unable to fight back, staring into the eyes of a man who had just killed a friend without hesitation. She screamed at him, her voice likely cracking with a mixture of terror and confusion, demanding to know what he had done and why he had done it, expecting perhaps a denial or a threat, but receiving neither. Izzy Renea did not turn the gun on her. nor did he seem to fully comprehend the gravity of the moral atrocity he had just committed. Instead, he looked at her with a detachment that was more terrifying than rage. He uttered a sentence that would haunt the investigation and the trial that followed, a sentence that revealed the depth of his delusion. "I thought he wanted me to." In Izzy's fractured mind, the murder wasn't a crime. It was a request, a twisted interpretation of reality where he believed the victim had solicited his own death. Before the pregnant woman could process this nonsensical justification, Izzy bolted past her, running out of the shed and disappearing into the night, leaving her alone with the body, the silence, and the terrifying realization that a monster had been in their midst. To understand how a quiet gathering devolved into a nightmare, we must examine the man at the center of the violence, Isaiah Jose Renteria, known to the streets and his acquaintances simply as Izzy. At 25 years old, Izzy was a figure who commanded attention not through charisma, but through an unsettling presence that seemed to radiate instability. He was physically imposing, tall and brooding, with a hairstyle that featured shaved sides and long hair on top, but it was his face that served as a warning sign to anyone who crossed his path. He had permanently altered his appearance with a series of distinctive and intimidating tattoos, jagged lightning bolts etched into his skin, an X marking his face like a target, and cryptic circles that suggested a chaotic inner world. These weren't just artistic choices. They were the markings of a man who had long ago drifted away from the norms of society, a man who lived on the fringe of the law and the fringe of sanity. His criminal history was a roadmap leading to this tragic night, littered with charges of sexual assault, strangulation, and battery, a pattern of escalating violence that prosecutors had tried to flag, warning judges time and time again that Izzy Renteria was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in the heart of the community. The evening of Sunday, April 28th, began innocently enough at the home on Princess Jean Drive, intended as a casual kickback to unwind and celebrate the weekend. Steven Sanchez Jr., fresh off his 34th birthday, was there to relax, as was the pregnant woman who lived in the home, along with two other unidentified men. However, the energy in the room shifted violently the moment Izzy arrived, bringing with him a dark cloud of paranoia that suffocated the light-hearted atmosphere. Witnesses would later recount to the Las Cruces Police Department that Izzy was visibly spiraling out of control, exhibiting classic signs of severe psychosis and delusion. He wasn't just anxious. He was actively hallucinating, pacing the floor and rambling about shapeshifters, a common manifestation of Capgras delusion where the sufferer believes that friends or family have been replaced by identical imposters. He told the people in that room, people who had welcomed him into their home, that he didn't believe they were human, that he saw them as monsters or entities trying to deceive him. Imagine sitting on a couch, pregnant and vulnerable, watching a man with lightning bolts tattooed on his face touch the handgun in his waistband while whispering that you are not a real person. The level of dread in that room must have been suffocating. I want to pause here for a second. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt the energy in a room shift from safety to danger, just based on one person's behavior? That gut feeling that tells you to leave? Tell me your story in the comments below, and let's discuss the importance of listening to those instincts. The danger was not abstract. It was physical and metallic, in the form of a handgun that Izzy had brought with him to the gathering. At one point in the evening, the tension reached a boiling point where the other men in the room, recognizing the volatility of the situation, managed to convince Izzy to surrender the weapon. For a brief window of time, the gun was secured, taken away from the man who was seeing demons in the faces of his friends, and the pregnant woman likely breathed a sigh of relief, believing the crisis had been averted. However, in a decision that will forever be scrutinized and regretted, the weapon was eventually returned to Izzy later in the night, perhaps under the false assumption that he had calmed down, or perhaps simply to get him to leave without a fight. Around 3:15 a.m., Izzy, Steven, and another man stood up and walked out the back door toward the shed, leaving the pregnant woman inside the main house. She watched them go, exhausted and desperate for sleep, unaware that by allowing Izzy to walk into that shed with a loaded gun, the group had sealed Steven Sanchez's fate. She stayed behind to rest her swollen feet, closing her eyes for what she hoped would be a peaceful night, unknowingly counting down the final seconds before her life would be shattered by the sound of a gunshot. The transition from the deafening crack of a gunshot to the chaotic symphony of emergency response is jarring, a rapid descent from silence into a whirlwind of sirens, shouting, and radio static that overwhelms the senses. Less than 60 seconds after the bullet struck Steven Sanchez Jr., the switchboard at the Mesilla Valley Regional Dispatch Authority lit up, signaling the start of a frantic race against time. The first call came from the home on Princess Jean Drive, likely from the pregnant woman herself, whose hands must have been shaking uncontrollably as she tried to relay the impossible horror of what she had just witnessed to the operator on the other end of the line. The dispatched officers from the Las Cruces Police Department tore through the sleeping streets of the city, their vehicles cutting through the darkness, adrenaline surging as the information came in fragments. Shooting, one male down, suspect fled on foot. When the first cruisers screeched to a halt in front of the residence, the officers stepped out into a scene of utter confusion. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion, while the occupants of the house were in a state of shock, pointing toward the backyard shed that had become a tomb. The air was thick with tension, not just because a crime had been committed, but because the location of the shooter was unknown. He could have been miles away, or he could have been watching them from the shadows of a neighboring yard, clutching the same weapon he had just used to execute his friend. Moving with tactical precision, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting jagged beams through the gloom, the officers made their way to the backyard, their boots crunching on the gravel as they approached the shed. The structure loomed ahead, a dark void in the corner of the property, and the officers had to prepare themselves for what they might find inside. Would the suspect still be there, waiting to ambush them, or would they only find the aftermath of his violence? Upon entering the shed, the reality of the situation became undeniably grim. They found 34-year-old Steven Sanchez Jr. lying on the ground, suffering from a catastrophic gunshot wound to the head that rendered any attempt at first aid futile. The finality of the scene was heavy. There was no struggle left to be had, only the procedural necessity of securing a crime scene that was rapidly growing colder by the second. For the first responders, the sight was a gruesome reminder of the fragility of life, but their immediate priority had to shift from rescue to containment. They quickly cleared the rest of the shed and the surrounding area, confirming that the shooter, the man identified as Izzy, had indeed vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of fear but no physical footprints to follow. The realization that an armed murderer was loose in the residential neighborhood turned the operation into an immediate manhunt, with officers establishing a perimeter and scanning every alleyway and bush for a tall man with lightning bolts on his face. In the midst of this swirling chaos, the investigation turned to the living, specifically to the pregnant woman who had stood face-to-face with the killer only moments after the trigger was pulled. Detectives approached her with a mixture of urgency and caution, recognizing that she was not only a critical witness, but a victim of severe psychological trauma who was physically vulnerable due to her pregnancy. Sitting perhaps on the bumper of an ambulance or a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket to ward off the chill of shock, she began to recount the surreal events of the night, her voice likely trembling as she repeated the nonsensical words of the killer. She told the officers about the shapeshifters, about Izzy's paranoia, and about that final, chilling exchange in the shed where he claimed, "I thought he wanted me to do it." This statement was a crucial piece of the puzzle for the investigators. It shifted the narrative from a drug deal gone wrong or a jealous lover's quarrel to something far more unpredictable, a mental health crisis that had culminated in homicide. The police realized they weren't looking for a rational criminal who would hide in a logical place. They were hunting a man operating under a completely different set of rules, a man whose delusion had rewritten reality to justify murder, making him infinitely more dangerous to the public. As the on-site investigation continued, police support staff back at the station began to pull the file on Isaiah Jose Renteria, and what they found on their screens confirmed their worst fears. Izzy was not a stranger to the system. His digital rap sheet was a long and violent scroll of offenses that painted a clear picture of a man spiraling downward for years. They saw the charges from 2022, the allegations of sexual assault and strangulation, and the repeated notes from prosecutors arguing that he was a danger to the community. warnings that had been legally noted but ultimately ineffective in keeping him behind bars. This background information transformed the search from a standard fugitive hunt into a high-stakes public safety emergency. They knew now that Izzy had a history of violence against women, a history of defying authority, and a history of mental instability that was currently peaking. The officers on the ground were alerted that the suspect was armed and dangerous in the truest sense of the words, and the description of his tattoos, the lightning bolts, the X, the circles, was broadcast across every channel. Every officer in Las Cruces was now looking for a face that was literally marked by chaos, knowing that if they didn't find him soon, the demons in his head might tell him to kill again. The immediate vicinity of Princess Jean Drive became the epicenter of a desperate search, with K-9 units deployed to track Izzy's scent through the labyrinth of suburban backyards and alleyways. The dogs pulled at their leashes, noses to the ground, trying to pick up the trail of a man who had fled in a panic, but the trail was frustratingly elusive. Police helicopters likely chopped the air overhead, their powerful spotlights sweeping the streets like the eye of God, turning night into day in an attempt to catch a glimpse of movement, a shadow running where it shouldn't be. Officers went door to door, waking up residents to ask if they had seen a tall man with a shaved head, warning families to lock their doors and stay inside, spreading a wave of terror through the community. Yet, despite the intensity of the dragnet, Izzy seemed to have evaporated into the desert air, slipping through the cracks of the perimeter in those crucial first minutes before containment was established. As the sun began to rise over the Organ Mountains, casting a pale light on the crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, the police had to accept the grim reality. The initial window of capture had closed, and the killer was gone. For 4 long, agonizing days, the city of Las Cruces held its collective breath, a community paralyzed by the knowledge that a murderer was moving among them, unseen and unheard. The fear was palpable in the grocery stores, in the gas stations, and in the quiet conversations between neighbors who checked their window locks twice before going to bed. The police had plastered Izzy's face on the news and social media, warning the public not to approach him. But as Monday turned to Tuesday, and Tuesday to Wednesday, the tips that came and led to dead ends. The investigation seemed to be hitting a wall of silence. It was as if Izzy Renteria had ceased to exist the moment he stepped out of that backyard on Princess Jean Drive. Detectives worked around the clock, re-interviewing witnesses, analyzing cell phone data, and trying to predict the movements of a man whose logic was fundamentally broken. But the unpredictability of a delusional fugitive makes standard profiling nearly impossible. Was he hiding in the desert? Had he fled south to the Mexican border, only 55 miles away? Or was he still here, watching the news reports of his own manhunt from a motel room or a friend's couch, convinced that the shapeshifters were closing in on him? The uncertainty was a heavy weight on the department, knowing that every hour Izzy remained free was another hour of potential violence. The break in the case, when it finally came, did not arrive through high-tech surveillance or forensic wizardry, but through the vigilance of a citizen who saw something and decided to speak up. Shortly after midnight on the morning of Thursday, May 2nd, 2024, 4 days after Steven Sanchez was left dead in the shed, an anonymous tipster placed a call that would end the stalemate. The caller reported seeing a man matching Izzy's distinct description: the height, the hair, the tattoos, driving a tan SUV near the center of town. This information was electrifying for the patrol units working the graveyard shift. Finally, they had a vehicle description and a location to target. The tan SUV wasn't just a car. It was a moving target that contained the most wanted man in the city. The dispatch went out, quiet but urgent, directing units to converge on the area, turning the streets into a hunting ground where every tan vehicle became a suspect. It is a testament to the randomness of police work that a killer can evade a massive manhunt for days, only to be undone by a single observant person who happened to look out their window at the right time. At approximately 1 a.m., an officer patrolling near the 200 block of Three Crosses Avenue spotted a vehicle that matched the tipster's description perfectly. The location was shocking in its proximity to the crime scene. Izzy was driving less than 3 miles away from the house on Princess Jean Drive, where he had murdered Steven Sanchez. He hadn't fled the state. He hadn't crossed the border. He had been ghosting through the same neighborhood, perhaps circling the scene of his crime, or simply aimlessly drifting through a city he could no longer call home. The officer, heart likely pounding against his vest, pulled a U-turn and slid in behind the SUV, verifying the plate and preparing to initiate a stop. At this moment, the tension inside the police cruiser would have been suffocating. The officer knew he was behind a man who had already killed once, a man who believed he was fighting monsters, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The officer flipped the switch, and the red and blue lights exploded into the night, painting the back of the tan SUV in the colors of authority. It was the moment of truth. Would Izzy pull over and surrender, or would the demons in his head tell him to run? The answer came instantly and violently. Instead of slowing down, the tan SUV lurched forward, the engine roaring as Izzy mashed the accelerator to the floor, desperate to escape the inevitable. The chase was on. The vehicle tore down the residential street, quickly exceeding 80 miles per hour in a zone designed for 30, turning the quiet road into a deadly raceway. The pursuing officer was now engaged in a high-speed pursuit, a dangerous calculus played out at breakneck velocity, where he had to balance the need to catch a murderer with the risk of endangering innocent civilians. Izzy was driving recklessly, swerving and speeding, his flight instinct overriding any sense of self-preservation. Inside the fleeing SUV, one can only imagine the chaotic state of Izzy's mind. Was he running from the police, or was he running from the shapeshifters he believed were chasing him? The officer knew that this could not continue. A high-speed chase through the city streets was a ticking time bomb that could end in a fiery crash involving bystanders. He had to end it, and he had to end it now. With a clarity of purpose born of training and adrenaline, the officer made the decision to execute a precision immobilization technique, known as a pit maneuver. He accelerated, closing the gap between his cruiser and the fleeing SUV, positioning his front bumper against the rear quarter panel of Izzy's vehicle. It is a move that requires nerves of steel, a controlled collision at high speed designed to destabilize the target. With a sharp turn of the wheel, the officer nudged the SUV, breaking its traction and sending it into a violent, uncontrolled spin. The tan SUV whipped around 180 degrees, tires screaming in protest, smoke billowing as it skidded to a halt, facing the wrong way on the road. The chase was over in terms of distance, but the danger was at its peak. As the dust settled and the police cruiser came to a stop, officers poured out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, creating a wall of steel and glass. They screamed commands into the night. "Show me your hands. Get out of the car," knowing that the man inside was armed, delusional, and cornered. This was the standoff that everyone had feared, the moment where the barrel of a gun would decide if the night ended in handcuffs or a body bag. The moments immediately following a high-speed collision are often defined by a sensory overload of dust, smoke, and adrenaline. And for the officers surrounding the tan SUV on Three Crosses Avenue, the air was thick with the potential for sudden violence. Having just executed a pit maneuver to stop a man known to be armed and delusional, the police did not hesitate. They swarmed the vehicle with weapons drawn, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of commands demanding compliance. "Show me your hands. Get out of the car," echoed through the dark street, a necessary aggression designed to shock the suspect into submission before he could reach for a weapon. Inside the vehicle, Izzy, Renea sat in the center of this storm, his escape route cut off, his vehicle disabled, and his freedom measured in seconds. Given his history of violence and his stated belief that he was being hunted by non-human entities, the officers were entirely justified in fearing a shootout. They were prepared for him to emerge fighting a war that existed only in his head. However, when the door finally opened, the resistance they anticipated never materialized. Izzy stepped out, not with the fury of a cornered animal, but with a bizarre, almost serene resignation. He followed the commands, lowering himself to the pavement, allowing the officers to swarm him, grab his wrists, and snap the handcuffs into place. The click of the steel ratchets signaled the end of the manhunt, but it was only the beginning of the attempt to understand the mind of the man they had just captured. As the adrenaline of the chase began to fade, replaced by the procedural rhythm of an arrest, the officers were struck by the suspect's demeanor, which was completely incongruous with the gravity of his situation. Izzy Renea, a man facing charges of first-degree murder, stood by the patrol car with a casual slump to his shoulders, chatting with the officers as if they were old acquaintances rather than the men who had just rammed his car off the road. When an officer informed him that he would be receiving an additional charge for fleeing the traffic stop, Izzy simply nodded and said, "I'll take that, boss, because I did. You were right there." It was a moment of lucid accountability that stood in stark contrast to his denial of the murder itself. When the topic of Steven Sanchez's death was broached, Izzy's wall of delusion went back up instantly. He looked at the officers and delivered a line that was as confusing as it was chilling. "I didn't do it, man. I normally do it, but I didn't do it." This statement, "I normally do it," offers a terrifying glimpse into his self-perception. He seemed to view himself as a person capable of violence, perhaps even prone to it, yet he insisted that in this specific instance, he was innocent. Was this a calculated lie, or had his mind so thoroughly rewritten the events of Monday morning that he genuinely believed he hadn't pulled the trigger? The transition from the street to the sterile, fluorescent environment of the Dona Ana County Detention Center did little to shake Izzy's nonchalance. During the booking process, the fingerprinting, the mugshot, the stripping of personal effects, he remained calm, a figure drifting through the system with a ghostly detachment. He was formally charged with first-degree murder, battery against a household member, and 6 counts of failure to appear in court for his previous crimes. A laundry list of offenses that would bury almost anyone under a mountain of anxiety. Yet, when asked if he had any injuries, he casually mentioned wounds on his hand, leg, and arm, relics of a life lived hard and fast, before asking for water. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, a standard legal maneuver, but in his case, it felt less like a strategy and more like a continuation of his refusal to accept reality. The man who saw shapeshifters and his friends now seemed to see himself as a victim of circumstance, trapped in a cage for a crime he believed he hadn't committed. For the detectives watching him, and for the pregnant woman waiting for justice, his calmness was an insult. How could he sit there so peacefully when he had destroyed a life and traumatized a mother-to-be only days before? The legal machinery began to turn on May 7th, 2024, at his bond hearing, a pivotal moment where the safety of the community hung in the balance. In previous years, Izzy had been released on bond despite facing serious charges, a flaw in the system that had allowed him to be free on the night of the murder. But this time, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. The stakes were lethal. Prosecutors from the county district attorney's office arrived prepared, laying out a comprehensive and disturbing pattern of criminal behavior that painted Izzy not just as a suspect, but as a predator whose violence was escalating. They argued that his release would pose an immediate and catastrophic threat to the public, citing the murder of Steven Sanchez as the tragic, inevitable result of his previous releases. They likely emphasized the danger he posed to the witnesses, specifically the pregnant woman who had identified him, arguing that a man who hallucinates monsters cannot be trusted to follow court orders. Judge Douglas Driggers, looking at the man with the lightning bolt tattoos and the file detailing a dead father, made the only decision that sanity would allow. He ordered Izzy to be held without bond. For the first time, the ticking time bomb was contained, locked away where his delusions could hurt no one but himself. Almost a year after the murder, in the spring of 2025, the case of the state of New Mexico versus Isaiah Jose Renteria finally went to trial. The courtroom became a theater where the horrific events of that April morning were replayed in excruciating detail, dissected by lawyers and absorbed by a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. The prosecution's case was a tapestry woven from forensic evidence, police testimony, and the harrowing account of the survivor. The woman who, though no longer pregnant, carried the permanent scar of having looked into the barrel of a gun and survived. The jury heard about the shapeshifters, the paranoia, and the senseless execution of Steven Sanchez Jr. They saw the photos of the shed, the diagram of the bullet's trajectory, and the face of the killer who sat at the defense table, likely still wearing the same mask of detached indifference. The defense may have argued for a lack of intent or highlighted his mental state, but the facts were stubborn and brutal. Izzy had brought a gun to a gathering. He had been safe, he had been disarmed, and yet he had rearmed himself and pulled the trigger. The question wasn't if he did it, But why? And for the law, because I thought he wanted me to, is not a justification. It is a confession of a dangerous mind. After deliberating, the jury returned with a verdict that offered a measure of accountability, if not total closure. They found Isaiah Renteria guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that implies an intentional killing that was not premeditated, perhaps acknowledging the chaotic, impulsive nature of his mental state at the time. Crucially, they also attached a firearm enhancement to the conviction, a legal mechanism that adds severe penalties for using a gun during the commission of a felony. This enhancement was the legal system's way of acknowledging the sheer lethality of his choice to arm himself. Standing before Judge Driggers for sentencing, Izzy faced the consequences of the terror he had unleashed. The judge, having seen the devastation caused by this man's actions and having heard the warnings that went unheeded in the past, showed no leniency. He handed down the maximum sentence allowed by law, 20 years in a high-security state prison. The gavel fell, echoing the finality of the gunshot, sealing Izzy's fate and removing him from society for 2 decades. 20 years is a long time, but for the family of Steven Sanchez Jr., it is a finite number that can never equal the infinite loss of a father, a son, and a friend. Steven will miss every birthday, every milestone, every moment of the future that was stolen from him in a dusty backyard shed. But there is another victim in this story who survived, and whose survival is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The woman who was pregnant that night, who walked into the darkness to check on her friends, is now a mother. She raises her child in a world where she knows that monsters are real, not the shapeshifters that Izzy saw, but the very real human beings who lose their grip on humanity. Every time she looks at her child, she might remember the night she protected that life from a man with lightning on his face. She carries the burden of the memory, the sound of the shot, and the image of a friend lying on the floor. This case serves as a terrifying reminder of the fragility of safety. We invite strangers into our homes, we trust our friends, and we assume that reality is shared by everyone in the room. But as the tragedy on Princess Jean Drive proves, we never truly know what is happening in the mind of another person. We never know when a friend will look at us and see a stranger, or when a quiet night will end in a headline. If you believe that the system failed by releasing Izzy on bond in 2022, let us know in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the cases that keep you up at night, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never ignore the red flags.